Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. This is the day we do our program called Mythbusters. The co-host today is Chris Rossini, who is also the editor of the Ron Paul LibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be back with you, Dr. Paul. Good morning.
Very good. We do this on a weekly basis. On Fridays, we go over certain things that we believe that are misunderstood in the media and bad assumptions, and people live with these myths for a long time. And the responsibility goes to those politicians who probably deliberately distort or do it by lack of understanding, or our universities teach the wrong kind of economics. So that's what we have today, Chris. So what kind of subjects can we bring up?
Okay, let's begin with this week was the passing of Chief Supreme Court Justice Scalia, and a lot of focus has naturally gone over to the Supreme Court. So that gives us an opportunity to cover a very important myth, and that's the myth that people think that the Supreme Court is almost equal to the Word of God, that when they say something, it's etched in stone, and they are the rulers, and that they have primacy over the executive and legislative branches. This obviously is not true, and I'd like for you to talk about that, Dr. Paul, the original intentions versus what the Supreme Court has become today.
Very good, because it is a very important issue, but it's not a new one, and Thomas Jefferson understood it very clearly. He fought it. He didn't want it to happen. He believed it would lead to the superiority of the courts, and that is giving the Supreme Court supreme authority, so to speak, over all laws, so they could endorse or refute any law that the Congress would pass and look over the executive branch as well. And the powers, according to Jefferson, were meant to be separate and competitive to keep the other ones in check, not to ever give more power to one over the other. The only one branch that many people conceded might have more clout would be the legislative branch, because they were answerable to the people easily every 2 years, and it would reflect the people's viewpoint, so things could occur much quicker. But the Supreme Court would be the most difficult to change because, especially the way it's evolved, if it's a life tenure, they get to stay, and it's very, very difficult. But early on, Jefferson's concerns came to fruition because of Marbury versus Madison. And in this case, which was a convoluted, complex case, but the important result is very clear. And this is where it was established that the Supreme Court declared that they have the last say over all legislation, which has led to a lot of trouble, which means that with 9 justices, one person has the vote to determine what 535 individuals do in the Congress, and also counteract what the presidents will do. So this is an ominous amount of power, the most significant event in recent history where one individual's played such an important role as one vote made the difference on who would be the president, in Bush versus Gore. So it is a power that has been around, and it keeps growing, but the people assume that this is the way it should be. Well, it doesn't. The Congress still has a lot of authority to restrain the legislative power of the executive branch, and but they don't even do this. They defer to the Supreme Court, and I've had people in the Congress tell me, well, we don't have to worry about the constitutionality of what we do because the Supreme Court will sort this all out, which is just a terrible statement because members of Congress take the oath of office as well, and they're supposed to interpret the Constitution, and if they do badly, the people will answer to it. But the Supreme Court, on some of the issues that they're supposed to have charge of, they haven't done a very good job. Because clearly the monetary issue, mandating that only silver and gold could be legal tender and no authority for a central bank, anytime that's gone to the Supreme Court, the government always wins. So this is an example of them legislating. Not only do they have this authority to legislate up or down on pieces of legislation, they get involved in tinkering agreeing with legislation. They say, therefore, this is what you should do, and it becomes the law of the land. So there are a lot of different ways that this could be handled, but unfortunately it is embedded into our system, our educational system, and I imagine if high school graduates now from public schools, even if they had an opinion, it would always be, oh, the Supreme Court makes all these decisions. And that is unfortunate. You know, the particular issue that they dealt with in Marbury versus Madison was the 1789 Judiciary Act, and they ruled that act was unconstitutional. The issue of exactly what was the consequence of that was sort of minor compared to this assumption that the Supreme Court could, in this very early part of our history, rule that the Supreme Court had authority over the Congress on what is constitutional or not. So it's an issue that's going to be around for a while. It's certainly being discussed now that there's an open seat. Jonathan Turley, a well-known scholar in constitutional law, thinks that the court is too powerful and 9 people is too much, one individual. He'd like to expand the court to 19, which is legal under the Constitution because it doesn't dictate how long they should stay in the judiciary as a justice, and it doesn't say how many there should be. But eventually reform should come. But in a way, it's a reflection of our society over the many, many years of our drift away from protecting individual liberty and allowing our governments to grow. But unfortunately, the executive branch took over legislative authority as well as the judicial branch, and the branch that was supposed to deal with legislation, they're sort of on the sidelines. They just run roughshod, and they don't even use the authorities that they have, the power of the purse, as well as denial of certain issues going to the Supreme Court. So it's an issue worth studying, but overall we have to get the people to understand what the purpose of government is, and it isn't to micromanage our society or our economy. It should be there to protect our liberties.
Yes. Next, let's move over to Bernie Sanders, and he's out on the campaign trail supposedly claiming that he wants to tear down Wall Street to size, and wants to break up the big banks. However, I did some research on Google and wanted to see how often he mentioned gold or sound money, and boy, I was going page after page, and I really didn't find anything. So how can Bernie really solve this problem that we have without addressing the root, which is fractional reserve banking and the central bank, the Federal Reserve System? Do you think that this is just a shell game that Bernie is playing on the American public?
Well, I believe I'd give him the benefit of the doubt that he's sincere, because he does give token support for looking more into the Federal Reserve. I would say that he doesn't understand the business cycle. He doesn't understand malinvestment. He doesn't understand that the most important body in Washington to prop up crony capitalism is the Federal Reserve. Now, I would suspect that he, as many other progressives admit, is that, yeah, we recognize that, but even Barney Frank would admit this. Yeah, we recognize this, and there are problems, but we can always solve it by regulations. We'll just turn the Federal Reserve loose, and then we'll regulate and maybe dictate. But the whole thing is, the monetary system is deeply flawed because it's inflationary. Debt is built on debt. It's the creator of debt. Now, Bernie would have at least public statements saying, well, we could spend a little less money overseas, even though he's not real consistent there with the military. But the whole thing is, the military doesn't exist without the Federal Reserve because it monetizes the debt. It runs up this huge amount of debt, so it facilitates the military-industrial complex. It facilitates the banking system, and no matter what they say about regulations, banks are too big to fail. They're not going to let it happen. Each failure will come about differently. This failure that we're working on right now is going to be different than 08 and 09, but believe me, they're going to continue to do the whole thing. They're not going to say, if you were on a gold standard, what you do is you withhold it, you go to the market, you liquidate the debt, and you let the market dictate interest rates. I've never, heard that said once before, but people who understand economies and the working class really in days past would support the gold standard. Samuel Gompers, the big leader in the labor movement, was a gold standard person, believing that gold protected the purchasing power of the working class, and yet there's hardly any talk about this. But Bernie Sanders has a lot of complicated ideas about what to do with the Federal Reserve, but he talks about it a little bit, but he doesn't talk about restraining this institution, because it's the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, which is put up by Reagan in 1987 to prevent stock market collapses. That's the whole purpose of this. So I haven't heard much talk by any of the candidates saying, well, we have to rein in this notion that the Federal Reserve is the important role for the Federal Reserve is to prop up Wall Street. So they have a long way to go. I think Bernie is a sincere person, but he does represent a different element. He just uses the Fed to prop up his friends, and his friends happen to be people who are not crony capitalists making a lot of money on Wall Street, but they might be crony people who want to live off the welfare state, and that, of course, is just as detrimental when you're using and endorse the power of government, whether it's legislative or through the monetary system, to steal from one group to another. And this is the whole thing. If Bernie was really concerned, he'd understand the monetary policy of the Austrian economists, in that when you destroy a currency, when you print too much and you devalue the currency, it eventually wipes out the middle class and directs the wealth to go to the wealthy, and therefore anybody who has wealth is called a crony capitalist, which is completely wrong. So the fact that Bernie doesn't sort this out means he doesn't understand the importance and the necessity of having sound money, something the founders understood very clearly.
Great points. Next, let's move on to a very important topic, and it's gaining a lot of steam, especially in the mainstream media, who are giving a lot of digital ink to it. And that's the war on cash. And just this week, we had former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers came out and wrote a whole piece on how he wants the government to abolish the $100 bill. Now, Dr. Paul, please cover the seriousness of this issue, both from a privacy perspective and, speaking of bailouts, how government would conduct bailouts if there was no cash.
Well, this demonstrates very clearly that when authoritarian institute policies and they don't work, they think the solution is more authoritarianism, more controls, more manipulations, more regulation of the economy. And Chris, you make a very good point about all of a sudden it's popping up in the ordinary media. This used to be a theoretical thing we've talked about for years that it would come, but it's moving quickly, much faster than I thought. So I hope the American people wake up to it, but it's always couched in what the good things are. They don't really tell you what's going on, that this is, they're concerned about, more economic planning and telling people to spend their money instead of saving money, and they can collect more revenues. This is what's really behind this. They'll use the excuse that, well, the drug dealers use this money and that we will be able to help curtail the drug dealers. Well, I have a better way of curtailing the drug dealers and the insanity of the drug wars. Get rid of the drug war. Don't encroach more on people who like to use cash. There's still a lot of people who use cash, and they should. They should have a right to do that. The ultimate test on a gold standard is, can you take the cash and always cash it in and get a gold coin to make sure the government's not cheating and they still have the gold there? Today, of course, that's not available to us. Roosevelt took care of that a long time ago. But today, people want to know whether they have cash, whether they can have a Federal Reserve note, because who knows? The banks may close, there'll be a bank holiday, and there may be taxation on the holdings in a bank, and you can't get it out. So no, you can't even, now you can't even go and get your cash out and put it in a shoebox, which right now looks like not a bad idea, because they're going to have negative interest rates. You can put money in a bank and the rate goes down. This is just representative of desperation of the authoritarians to try to maintain a system that is non-viable, and it can't work. They actually preach the gospel that if the consumer would only spend more money, we could get out of this recession. They blame blame the consumer. Of course, the consumer's worried, tries to plan for the future, wants to save money and can't earn interest, and it goes on. But at the same time, if you can't put it in the bank and they won't let you take it out in cash, and you're losing money in the bank, they're hoping people would spend some more money. And that is total nonsense on how a market works. You have to have a system where people work hard, save money, and build up capital, and then either invest it themselves or allow somebody else to use your money to invest. But that is not heard of. Debt now is considered good. The more debt, the better. We just have to manipulate more and more. But this is a struggle between those who want to control us through the monetary system, and zero interest rates will compound this even more so because people will want to go to cash, and then the iron hand and the iron fist of government will come down and say, no, you can't do this. But there's still a lot of average people and middle-class people still like the use of cash, but it should be an issue of liberty. It should be, can I hold the money in my hand? And although you can't cash it in for a fixed amount of gold, at least if you had a significant amount of paper money and Federal Reserve notes, and they won't let you take it out, possibly you could circumvent this by, holding some gold in your hand. But then again, governments have been notorious in attacking individuals like that, like they did in the 30s. But I think this is a serious thing about getting rid of cash. It's symbolic. It's going on in Europe. They want to get rid of the 500 euro note, and there's some objection. But once again, it's always put into this category of doing good for the people, helping the economy, and fighting terrorism and fighting the drug war. That's all just propaganda, and we ought to live up to the fact that we need to know the truth. And the truth is that we ought to have the right to spend our money and keep our money and put it in gold if we want to.
Right. Okay, let's finish up, Dr. Paul, with a myth that we haven't covered, and it always pops up. This one has a lot of legs. It always pops up during election season, and that's with Ronald Reagan, the Reagan myth. And we'll use Marco Rubio, a quote that he used this week. He said, "Reagan was able to instill in our nation a sense of optimism, and he turned our country around." Dr. Paul, did Ronald Reagan turn this country around, or did he just grow government with a different veneer with his rhetoric?
Well, in a way, first half of your statement could possibly be true, because he did make people feel better about themselves, and he had a smile. He did it. And he's the president that I knew the best, and even on a personal conversation, he said he endorsed the gold standard. So he is a very likable person. But this is a myth that Reagan turned anything around. Matter of fact, he put the conservatives to sleep, because he joined in. He listened to the supply-siders, and the supply-siders said, the liberal Democrats, the progressives, spend all the money and they get all the credit for doing so many good things for the people. Then Republicans come along and say, well, we don't need deficits. What we need is collect more revenues and have a balanced budget. And that wasn't very popular. So supply-siders come along and say, well, deficits really don't matter. And so far, we've been living by that, but they really do matter, and they're starting to matter, and that's why we're in this crisis. But Reagan was terrible on financial things, and he doubled and tripled many of the budget. He doubled the Department of Education, as well as farm subsidies, and medical expenses went up ×2. National debt under Reagan went up threefold. It was very extraordinary. And then they say, well, yeah, at least he cut taxes. Yeah, one. The only real significant program that Reagan did that I could support was the first tax cut. But that was eliminated rather quickly by raising taxes 3 times after that. The conservatives never remember that. And so he was hardly a non-interventionist in foreign policy when you think of some of the things that he did, including bombing of Libya. So it's a myth for sure that Ronald Reagan turned anything around. I think he sort of solidified the fact that conservatives could come over and comfortably be big government deficit spending conservatives, and we've been doing it ever since. So that is the reason that it is indeed a great myth when you hear conservative Republican presidential candidates trying to wrap around the conservatism and the fiscal responsibility that Reagan represented. He represented big government. One quick little story of this, though, is the very first budget for Reagan. And Reagan ran against Carter because his deficit was too big. And every Republican voted against Carter's last budget. Then Reagan comes in the first year, he tripled the deficit, and every Republican was supposed to vote for it. And I wouldn't vote for it. I said, this is 3 times bigger than what Carter had, and we all voted against it. What are we doing? Oh, this is Reagan's budget. We have to do it. And they became very angry with me. And believe me, they never forgot it, because then I left Congress. I was out 12 years and ran in 96, and the Reagan administration individuals came into my district to campaign against me because, I would not support Ronald Reagan. So, but truth won out in the end, and the people finally said, well, maybe he, in our district at least, maybe he wasn't all that conservative anyway. But anyway, Chris, thank you very much today for being our co-host.
My pleasure, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
Very good. And I want to thank all the listeners for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.